Welcome to this massive open online course on Indian Economics 1. Today our module is on savings and investment in India. And after the completion of this module, you can well understand the trajectory of gross domestic savings and gross domestic investment or gross domestic capital formation in India during the planned period. You can identify the sources of gross domestic savings and the decomposition of these savings and investment in India, and you can also identify the reasons behind the low level of gross domestic savings as well as some saving investment puzzle in Indian economy. So let us first start with the basic concept of capital accumulation, because capital accumulation means the change in the stock of capital in an economy. And there are three sources of capital accumulation. The first is the creation of small savings. The second is mobilization of small savings. And the third one is channelization of that mobilized savings into productive investment. So you can well understand the linkage between savings, investment, and capital accumulation in a society. In this connection, the importance of savings and investment in our economy can be indicated by a simple model which was developed by Hollis Chenery in his dual gap theory. This theory suggests that if the gap between your planned investment and actual savings is more than the import-export gap, then your growth will be constrained by low savings. Now, let us start with the basic model. The basic model starts here with an equilibrium situation. This equilibrium situation shows on the left-hand side Y. Y means aggregate output in the economy, and on the right-hand side you have C plus I plus G. What is C? C means consumption expenditure, I means investment expenditure, private, G means government expenditure. So this together, sum of C plus I plus G indicate aggregate demand for domestic output, and X means export and M means import. So X minus M in an open economy means net export. So this is foreign demand for your domestic output. So on the right hand side you have aggregate demand, and on the left hand side you have aggregate supply. So this equation actually indicates an equilibrium situation where aggregate supply is just equal to the aggregate demand. Now this can be represented as Y minus T. What is T? T is tax payment. So Y minus T indicates disposable income. So if you take C to the left hand side, so you have Y minus T minus C, which indicates your private savings. And since you have deducted T, so you again add T, the tax, and you take that G to the left hand side. What you get? You get T minus G, which is tax revenue minus government expenditure. That indicates the government saving. And you take private investment to the left hand side. So what you get? You get private investment SP plus private savings SP plus government savings SG minus I. So this private savings plus government savings together, that gives rise to aggregate savings in the economy. So on the left hand side what you get saving minus investment, and on the right hand side you have export minus import. Alternatively, what you can say investment minus savings is just equal to import minus export, and this is what is called as dual gap. On the one hand you have a gap between your intended investment or planned investment in the economy and your actual savings, that creates a gap, and on the right hand side is just equal to, at equilibrium it will be equal to your import export gap. Now Chenery's model suggests that if at any given level of income, if your investment savings gap is more than import-export gap, then your growth will be constrained by that lower savings. So from this model you can well understand the importance of gross domestic savings in ensuring the economic growth of a country. Now next in this figure 1, we have a trajectory of the growth trend of gross domestic savings in India during 1951 to 2020. Long period. So to start with, if you look in this diagram, you find that during the first 5-year plan, the gross domestic savings as a percentage of gross domestic product at current prices was only 9.2%, very low. And gradually it went up to 11% during the second 5-year plan. It remained almost stagnant during the third 5-year plan and the annual plan, 12.7%, and gradually it went up to 18% during the fifth 5-year plan. Now, what is the basic reason behind the gradual increase in this gross domestic savings? Some of the economists pointed out that during this period, the composition or the contribution of different sectors towards GDP changed. And we observe that the contribution of the primary sector or the agricultural sector towards gross domestic product gradually declined, and the contribution of the secondary sector, that means industrial sector, and the tertiary sector, that is the service sector, gradually increased. And we know that the marginal propensity to save from the income that is being created in the secondary sector and tertiary sector is supposed to be higher than the marginal propensity to save in case of agricultural income. So as you see the shift gradually from primary to secondary and tertiary sector in the gross domestic product, that may be the reason behind the gradual increase in aggregate savings in the economy. That is number one. Number two, some other economists pointed out that during this time period, with the nationalization of commercial banks since 1969, there was a gradual expansion of bank branches in even in the rural areas. So the tendency towards the financial savings was rising. And the third one was the rise in the foreign remittance in our country during 1970s. So all together led to that gradual increase in gross domestic savings in India. And during fifth and sixth 5-year plan, you find that average GDS declined to some extent, and the planners as well as the RBI, Reserve Bank of India report suggests that during that period, due to inflationary pressure, due to price rise, the real income declined, and that might be the reason behind this fall in gross domestic savings during that period. But starting from 1985 up to this period of 11 5-year plan, that is 2012, you find a gradual upward movement of gross domestic savings in India. However, during the period 2012 to 2020, there has been a gradual decline in gross domestic savings. Planners and economists, they are of the opinion that this recent decline in gross domestic savings may be due to the global slowdown or growth in Indian economy without the creation of job. We call it job loss growth, and the falling remittance from abroad. That might be the reason behind this falling GDS in India. Now, this we have already explained, and now we can make a comparison between the GDS, gross domestic savings in India, along with other countries or other regions of the globe. To start with, during 1960 to 73, we observed that the gross domestic savings in India was quite low in comparison to that of China or in East Asian Pacific regions. It was even lower than the OECD countries, that means Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development countries, which included mostly the developed European countries, Australia and USA. But gradually what you observe that during the period 1960 to 2020, gradually our savings is India's gross domestic savings has gradually increased, and but still now it is lower than that of China. It is lower than that of East Asian Pacific region. But compared to the low-income economies, our GDS is much higher. So that was the comparison with other countries and other regions. Now, this is an important part where you can understand the sources of GDS. Actually, there are three specific sources. GDS arises from the household sector, that is contribution of the household sector to the gross domestic savings, contribution of the private corporate sector, and the contribution of the public sector. So if you compare between these three sectors, you will always find that the contribution of the household sector in our gross domestic savings has always been highest. And if you make percentage terms, in the total GDS, the contribution of the household sector was about 70% and higher. And the trend also indicates that gradually the household sector savings were rising. But interestingly enough, what you observe that during the first 5-year plan up to that 7th 5-year plan, the contribution of the public sector, was higher in GDS compared to the private corporate sector. This green bar indicates the contribution of the public sector, of the government sector, their savings. But after 1990, that is since that new economic policy emerged in India, we observe the opposite picture. That means then gradually we observe the contribution of the public sector towards gross domestic savings of India has gradually declined, and even we observe that during 9th 5-year plan it was negative. The domestic savings in the public sector was negative, and gradually the gap between the contribution of the private corporate sector and public sector increased. So from this diagram it becomes clear that in India the private savings dominates and government savings is much lower than the private savings. And within the private sector, household sector dominates. The next one is very interesting. That is, you observe that the gross domestic savings in India has increased. But how far that savings has helped us to achieve the growth target? To indicate this relation, we have taken the help of a simple Harrod-Domer model. In earlier modules, we have covered this particular model. This shows that growth rate of income in India is denoted by G, which is YT minus 1 divided by YT. What is YT? Income at the period T minus income at the period T minus 1. So that is indicated by delta Y. Delta Y means change in income divided by original income. So that is the growth in income. This can be expressed in terms of delta Y by delta K, which indicates productivity of capital multiplied by delta K by Y. What is delta K? Change in capital accumulation, which is nothing but investment. So if you make an inverse, that is, if you express it as 1 divided by delta K by delta Y, which we call as incremental capital output ratio. It means to raise output by 1 rupee, how much capital you require. That is called incremental capital output ratio. It is technologically given, and that is denoted by V. At equilibrium level of income, your aggregate investment and savings must be equal. So I and S are equal. So what you get at last? You get S by Y. What is S by Y? Out of your income, what amount you are saving. So given V, if you can increase your savings rate, then you can obviously raise your growth rate. Now, if your growth target is given, G star, you fix the target, then what should be the required savings ratio, which is given by S star? This S star can be then determined by multiplying that incremental capital output rate ratio with your targeted growth rate. Now, please see what happened in India. In India, we observe that during the 5-year plans, I have taken some of the 5-year plans and I have indicated the target incremental capital output ratio, which actually indicates the productivity of capital. And lower the ICOR, higher the productivity, and higher the ICOR means lower productivity of capital. So you find the difference between actual incremental capital output ratio, which is higher. That means your target was low incremental capital output ratio or high capital productivity. But ultimately what we observed that in most of the plans, the capital productivity was lower than the target. And your growth target in every plan I have indicated, and if you now want to achieve this growth target, then you can multiply this rate of growth of GDP with your ICOR, and you get that required gross domestic savings. So in column D, we are getting the required gross domestic savings as a percentage of GDP. But the actual gross domestic savings as a percentage of GDP was much lower. Therefore, this is one of the crises. That means in India, the gross domestic savings, that is rising, but it was not sufficient to achieve the growth target. That is the point. Now, what are the reasons behind this low gross domestic savings in India? First reason is our per capita income remains at a very low level. And second reason is exemption of agricultural income from income tax. If you exempt agricultural income, then some of the big farmers, rich cultivators, they may not recycle their savings into investment. So their savings may convert into conspicuous consumption, say unnecessary consumption without any productive investment. And there is another reason called as demonstration effect. What is demonstration effect? Demonstration effect means when people with low income, they want to imitate the lifestyle of some developed economy, then they may spend more than their income capacity. So they have to borrow. So if they borrow, then the savings capacity will be lower. Therefore, demonstration effect may also be the reason for low GDS in India. And the other points are inadequate savings in the public sector, because in the public sector or the government sector, we observed that most of the public sector units were running under huge loss because of, say, some inappropriate pricing policy, because of some managerial incapacity, underutilization of productive capacity. There are several reasons for this low savings generation in Indian public sector. And even in private corporate sector also, because of poor fund management policy in most of the private sector units, we also observe comparatively lower, savings generation compared to our household sector. So these are the reasons behind the low GDS in India. Now coming to the GDI, gross domestic investment, which is actually the gross domestic capital formation in India. And if you see the trend, you observe that gradually from the first 5-year plan period to up to, about 11th 5-year plan, gradually it has increased. In between, during third plan and annual plan, you observe a sort of stagnancy, but gradually it has increased. So the gross domestic investment has increased, gross domestic savings has increased. Now the question is there any gap between these two, gross domestic investment and gross domestic investment? Yes. If you find some gap between these two, in this figure 4, I have shown the gap between the gross domestic investment and gross domestic savings in India. If you find that gross domestic investment is more than gross domestic savings, that gap indicates that net flow, foreign inflow of capital. That means your dependence on the foreign capital. Therefore, here we observe that in most of the 5-year plans, our gross domestic investment remained higher than gross domestic savings. Particularly, you can see the 5th 5-year plan where they are almost similar. Even in 9th 5-year plan, they are almost the same. Now, the question is why they remain same during 5th 5-year plan. The reason behind is that during 5th 5-year plan, you can remember the objective was import substitution and self-reliance. That means at the terminal year of the planning, the objective was to minimize the foreign inflow of capital. So if you minimize, you maintain almost zero capital inflow, then your GDI, gross domestic investment, and GDS, gross domestic savings, must be equal. So these are the reasons behind almost equality in some of the plans between GDS and GDI. Now, within the GDI, if you decompose further, you will find that one part of the GDI, gross domestic investment, arises from the public sector, the government sector, and another part arises from the private corporate sector. Now, if you just compare their contributions, here I have indicated this red bar indicates the private contribution, private corporate sector's contribution to gross domestic investment. Now, interestingly enough, what you observe that up to, 8th 5-year plan, what you observe up to the 7th 5-year plan, in our previous diagram, we observed that public sector savings was more than the private sector savings. But here what you observe, that public sector investment is less than private corporate sector investment. So this is very interesting. That means public sector saving, it is creating more savings during the first phase of planning, but investment, in terms of investment, its investment is less than private corporate sector. That means that even if the public sector, the government sector created savings, that could not be converted into proper investment. Why? Because of revenue expenditure instead of capital expenditure. Even in government budget, you will find that revenue expenditure, that means expenditure for administrative purposes, for government salary, etc., that is much higher than the capital expenditure. So, private corporate sector expenditure, that means their investment in productive investment, was found to be much higher, and that gap actually increased during the post-reform period, that is since 8th five-year plan. So in this diagram, it becomes clear the difference between the public and the private sector's contribution towards the GDI in India. Now, coming to another very important aspect of the saving investment and the puzzle therein. Saving investment puzzle is nothing but in some of the period, for example, during 1951 to 1969, we observed that both gross domestic savings as well as gross domestic investment as a percentage of GDP that increased gradually. But that was not reflected in the GDP growth. In fact, during that time period, during 1951 to 1969, the GDP growth rate declined. So this is a puzzle, because in the Harrod-Domer model, what you have observed, that given the incremental capital output ratio, if you can increase your savings rate, if you can increase your investment rate, then your growth rate in GDP must increase. But here you find something opposite. So that is a puzzle. Now, what are the reasons behind this puzzle? Economists, they have pointed out that the puzzle may be because of the upward bias in CSO estimate. That means Central Statistical Organization, they estimate our savings and investment. Professor Mihir Rakshit and several other economists, they are of the opinion that there must be some upward bias in this estimation, so that the figure may be more than the actual figure. That is number one point. Number two, the incremental capital output ratio, okay, despite the growth in GDS and GDI, maybe higher, maybe high. That means you have in the you have in the denominator, you have your incremental capital output ratio, and in the numerator, you have savings ratio. So your savings ratio is rising, but in the denominator, if the incremental capital output ratio also rises, then the growth rate may not increase. So rise in ICOR means fall in productivity. So that is another reason, that is because of increase in incremental capital output ratio or the fall in productivity, your increasing GDS and GDI was not actually reflected in GDP growth. Okay? Or, as I have already pointed out, the higher revenue expenditure by the government, that may be another reason for this saving investment puzzle. And we also observed this type of puzzle during 1974 to 1985. Here the puzzle is just a bit different. Here what we observed, that during this period, 1974 to 1985, our gross domestic savings and gross domestic investment, that indicated either a gradual decline or a stagnancy. But despite that, our GDP growth indicated an increasing trend. That means it increased from 4.9% to 5.4%. And this phase also, the puzzle can be explained by a decline in ICOR. That means now, because of higher productivity of capital, the GDP growth was rising. And during this period, another reason may be better availability of capital with foreign collaboration and say a gradual liberalization in import policy, so that you can easily import foreign technology or foreign capital. That may be another reason. And another important reason was preference for savings in private corporate securities. When people spend more, invest more in private corporate securities, then the private, that is being shifted to private sector, and the private corporate sector normally undertakes such projects where the productivity of capital is relatively higher. So these are the reasons, maybe the reasons behind the saving investment puzzle in India in some time periods. So in this module, what we observe the gradually both gross domestic savings and gross domestic investment in India has gradually increased, but it was observed that the contribution of the household sector was more than the contribution of the private sector and public sector, and the required gross domestic savings, that means to ensure our targeted growth rate, the gross domestic savings was inadequate, so we had to depend on foreign inflow of foreign capital. And gradually what we observe that in case of gross domestic investment also, the private corporate sector dominated over the say government sector, and that gap was say higher and higher during the post-reform period. So I think this model this module can help you in understanding, in explaining the trend in our GDS and GDI, the fluctuations in GDI and GDS, and the implication or the importance of gross domestic savings and gross domestic investment in ensuring our growth target during the plan period. Thank you so much for joining this particular module.